Part 1. The Spark. What if the one place meant to uphold justice became the stage for its betrayal? What if a single act of violence could unravel a system built on silence? On a crisp March morning in 2025, the Chicago courthouse buzzed with its usual chaos, lawyers shuffling papers, clerks calling out names, and the low hum of anticipation filling the air. But beneath the polished marble floors and the weighty echoes of legal proceedings, something darker simmered, something that had festered for too long. Judge Amara Sinclair felt it every day, a quiet tension woven into the fabric of her work, a reminder that justice wasn't always blind, not for everyone. At 42, Amara was a force of nature, a black woman who had clawed her way to the bench of the Illinois Superior Court through sheer brilliance and unrelenting grit. Her sharp eyes, framed by a cascade of braids pulled neatly into a bun, missed nothing. Her presence commanded respect, even if it wasn't always freely given. She'd spent her career proving herself in a system that often saw her skin before her credentials. A system where whispered doubts about her place lingered in the halls like stale smoke. But Amara didn't bend. She never had. Today, though, would test that resolve in ways she couldn't have foreseen. It started outside the courtroom, just beyond the heavy oak doors she'd walked through 1,000 times. She'd stepped out for a breath of fresh air, a momentary escape from the suffocating weight of a docket filled with petty thefts and procedural hearings. The Chicago wind bit at her cheeks as she adjusted her coat, her mind already turning to the next case. That's when she heard it, a sharp cry, raw and desperate, cutting through the morning clamor like a blade. Her head snapped toward the sound, and her stomach tightened at what she saw. A teenage boy, no older than 16, stood pinned against the courthouse steps by a uniformed officer. The kid's hands were raised, palms open in a universal gesture of surrender. His cheap jacket bunched up around his shoulders. His dark skin glistened with sweat, his eyes wide with fear. The officer, broad-shouldered, white, with a buzz cut and a badge that gleamed under the pale sunlight, loomed over him. Nathan Briggs, his name tag read. Amara didn't know him personally, but she'd seen his type before, the kind of cop who wore authority like a weapon, who saw certain faces as threats before they even opened their mouths. "Get your hands higher, kid," Briggs barked, his voice thick with contempt. He shoved the boy harder against the stone, ignoring the small crowd gathering nearby, people pulling out phones, whispering, watching. The teenager stammered something incoherent, his voice cracking. But Briggs wasn't listening. He yanked the boy's arm, twisting it behind his back with a force that made Amara wince. She'd seen this scene play out too many times. On the news, in case files, in the stories her father used to tell her late at night, stories of a world that didn't bend for people like them. "Officer," Amara called out, stepping forward, her tone firm but measured. "Is there a problem here?" She kept her hands visible, her posture calm, knowing full well how quickly things could escalate. She wasn't in her robes, just a tailored coat and slacks, but her voice carried the weight of someone who didn't back down. Briggs turned, his eyes narrowing as they landed on her. For a split second, she saw it, the flicker of dismissal, the assumption that she was just another bystander, another blackface meddling where it didn't belong. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" he snapped, his lip curling into a sneer. His grip on the boy didn't loosen. "Mind your business, lady. This doesn't concern you." Amara took another step closer, her heels clicking against the pavement. "I asked you a question, Officer Briggs," she said, her voice steady, slicing through his arrogance like a scalpel. "What's the problem?" Briggs laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine. "You people," he muttered, shaking his head as if she were a child who'd wandered too far from home. "Always sticking your nose where it don't belong." The words hit her like a slap, laced with centuries of venom, a reminder of every time she'd been told she didn't fit. "You people." She'd heard it in boardrooms, in classrooms, in the subtle glances of colleagues who questioned her right to be here. But hearing it now, from this man in uniform, with his boot inches from a child's neck, it ignited something inside her. Something fierce and unyielding. Before she could respond, Briggs moved. It was fast, deliberate, a shove that sent her stumbling back, her heel catching on the edge of a step. Pain shot through her ankle as she hit the ground. the air rushing out of her lungs in a sharp gasp. The crowd gasped too, a ripple of shock spreading through them. But no one moved, not the bystanders, not the security guard hovering near the entrance. They just watched, frozen in that familiar paralysis that let men like Briggs act without fear. He towered over her now, his smirk dripping with confidence, his polished boot gleaming as he stepped closer. "Stay down," he spat, his voice low and menacing. "You don't know who you're messing with." Amara's breath steadied, her hands pressing against the cold stone as she pushed herself up. Slowly, deliberately, she rose, brushing the dirt from her coat, her eyes locking onto his with a calmness that felt more dangerous than any outburst. Pain throbbed in her side, but she ignored it. This wasn't about her, not anymore. This was about every kid like the one trembling behind Briggs. Every case buried under bureaucracy. Every time a badge had been a shield for hate. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" she said, her voice low, controlled, lethal. Briggs scoffed, crossing his arms, his broad chest puffing out as if to prove his point. But then she smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a shiver through the air. "I am Judge Amara Sinclair," she said, each word a hammer striking stone. "And you just assaulted a sitting judge in front of witnesses." The color drained from Briggs' face, his smirk faltering, then collapsing into something raw and unfiltered, fear. The crowd murmured, phones still raised, capturing every second. Amara straightened, her chin lifting as she gestured to the security guard who'd finally snapped out of his stupor. "Arrest him," she ordered, her voice ringing with authority. "Now." Briggs' jaw tightened, his hands twitching at his sides. But he didn't move, not yet. The guard hesitated, then stepped forward, cuffs in hand. The air shifted, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a spark, one that could set the whole damn system ablaze. And Amara Sinclair was ready to watch it burn. Part 2. The fire ignites. The video hit the internet like a match tossed into dry grass. Within hours of Judge Amara Sinclair's confrontation with Officer Nathan Briggs, the grainy footage, shaky but unmistakable, spread across social media, igniting a firestorm that Chicago wasn't ready for. By noon on that same March day in 2025, the clip had racked up millions of views. Briggs shoving the teenage boy, his sneering dismissal of Amara, the brutal push that sent her crashing to the courthouse steps, and then her calm, unshakable rise, capped with those 4 words, "I am Judge Amara Sinclair," that turned the whole scene upside down. The caption read simply, "Justice or abuse? You decide." Amara sat in her chambers. The door closed, the hum of the courthouse muted behind thick walls. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the desk, texts from colleagues, calls from reporters, notifications piling up like a digital avalanche. She ignored them all, her eyes fixed on the laptop screen where the video looped silently. Each frame burned into her mind, the boy's terrified face, Briggs' smug arrogance, the way no one had moved to help her until she'd revealed who she was. It wasn't just an assault on her body, it was an assault on everything she'd fought for. Everything she'd sworn to protect. A sharp knock broke her focus. Before she could respond, the door swung open, and Maya Carter stepped inside, her youthful energy crackling like static. At 28, Maya was a rising star in the legal world. A black woman with a law degree from Northwestern and a fire in her gut that reminded Amara of herself 2 decades ago. She'd been Amara's mentee for the past year. A partnership forged in late-night case reviews and shared frustration with a system that too often failed their communities. "You've seen it, right?" Maya said, shutting the door behind her. She didn't wait for an answer. Dropping a tablet onto the desk with a news headline glaring in bold. "Judge assaulted by cop. Hero or hothead?" Twitter's losing its mind. Half the city's calling you a legend. The other half's saying you provoked him. The police union's already spinning it, claiming Briggs was de-escalating a threat. Amara leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "A threat," she repeated, her voice dry as ash. "A 16-year-old kid with his hands up. Me asking a question. Some threat." Maya smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They're scared. Amara, you flipped their script. A black woman in power calling out one of their own? They don't know how to handle that." She hesitated, then added, "But they're not going down quiet." I just overheard 2 prosecutors in the hall. One of them said you're too emotional to be impartial now. They're laying the groundwork to discredit you. Amara's jaw tightened. Too emotional. She'd heard that before, subtle jabs cloaked as concern. A way to undermine her authority without saying the real words. Too black. Too female. Too defiant. It was the same game she'd faced her whole career. From the time she'd walked into Harvard Law as one of the only black students in her class. Enduring whispers that she was there on a quota, not merit. She'd proven them wrong every step of the way. But the rules never seemed to change. Let them try, she said finally, her voice steady. We've got the footage. We've got witnesses. This isn't slipping away. Maya nodded, pulling up a chair. Good, because I've got something else. I called a friend at the Tribune, off the record. She's digging into Briggs' record. Says there's a trail of complaints. Excessive force mostly, but they've all been buried. Internal Affairs rubber stamped them as unsubstantiated. Sound familiar? Too familiar. Amara muttered. She'd seen it in her courtroom. Cases dismissed. Evidence lost. Victims too scared or too broken to push back. Her father had warned her about it decades ago. A weary lawyer who'd burned out fighting battles he couldn't win. The system protects its own. Mara, he'd said, always has. But she wasn't her father. She wasn't here to lose. We need that paper trail, Amara said, leaning forward. Every report, every cover-up. If Briggs is a symptom, I want the disease. Maya grinned, already tapping notes into her phone. On it, my friend's meeting me tonight. And I'll loop in Jamal. He's a freelance journalist I know. Got a nose for corruption and a platform that doesn't bow to the PD. We'll hit them from every angle. Amara nodded, a flicker of pride warming her chest. Maya was sharp, fearless. A partner she hadn't expected but was damn glad to have. Good, but watch yourself. They'll come for anyone tied to this. As Maya left, Amara turned back to her laptop. The video still paused on Briggs' sneering face. She could feel the storm building, outrage online. Pressure from the brass. The weight of a city watching her next move. She wasn't naive. She knew what she'd started wouldn't end with one arrest. But she wasn't backing down either. By evening, the fallout was impossible to ignore. The police union released a statement. Officer Nathan Briggs acted in good faith to maintain order. Judge Sinclair's overreaction has unfairly maligned a dedicated public servant. Dedicated. Amara nearly laughed at the word. Dedicated to what? Terrorizing kids? Breaking bones? She flipped on the TV in her office, catching a news anchor mid-sentence. Questions remain about Judge Sinclair's objectivity. Sources close to the department suggest she may have escalated the situation unnecessarily. Escalated. Another dog whistle. Another way to paint her as the problem. She muted the TV, her eyes narrowing as she caught her reflection in the dark screen, a woman who'd spent her life proving she belonged. Only to be questioned the moment she demanded accountability. Then her phone buzzed again. A text. No name. Just a number she didn't recognize. Careful what you stir up. Some things don't stay buried. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. She set the phone down, her fingers curling into a fist. If they thought a vague threat would stop her, they didn't know who they were dealing with. Outside, the city buzzed with a restless energy, protests forming in pockets. Hashtags trending, voices rising. Inside the courthouse, Amara felt the walls closing in, the air thick with unspoken rules she just shattered. She'd lit the match, and now the fire was spreading. Briggs' arrest wasn't the end, it was the beginning. And she was ready to fan the flames. Part 3. Uncovering the truth. The clock in Amara Sinclair's chambers ticked past midnight, its steady rhythm a faint counterpoint to the storm brewing beyond the courthouse walls. Papers sprawled across her desk, case files, handwritten notes, a half-empty coffee mug stained with hours of determination. The video of Nathan Briggs' assault played on her laptop again. Muted now, its images seared into her memory like a brand. She wasn't watching it for herself anymore, she was searching for cracks. Details. Anything that could lead her deeper into the rot she knew festered beneath his badge. This wasn't just about one cop, it never had been. Maya burst through the door without knocking, her arms laden with a cardboard box that looked like it had been through a war. Jackpot, she said, dropping it onto the desk with a thud that sent papers fluttering. Her eyes gleamed with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Jamal came through. These are copies, Briggs personnel file. Incident reports. The works. Stuff the PD thought they'd buried. Amara straightened, pushing aside her fatigue. How'd he get them? Maya grinned, pulling out a stack of documents. Let's just say Jamal knows people who know people. Off-the-record sources in internal affairs. They're not all happy with the blue wall of silence. She handed Amara a faded complaint form. The edges yellowed with age. Start here. Darius Jackson, 2018. 22 years old, black, unarmed. Said Briggs beat him unconscious during a traffic stop. Claimed it was racial profiling. Guess what happened? Amara skimmed the page, her jaw tightening as she read the handwritten dismissal. Insufficient evidence. Officer acted within protocol. Nothing, she muttered. They swept it under the rug. Like always, Maya said, digging deeper into the box. There's more. A woman in 2020. Said Briggs fractured her wrist after she questioned a search. A kid in 22, broken nose. Bruised ribs. Same story. At least a dozen complaints over 7 years. All black or Latino victims. All unsubstantiated. Someone's been protecting him. Amara's fingers tightened around the paper, the weight of it sinking into her bones. She'd seen this pattern in her courtroom. Cases that never made it to trial. Victims silenced by fear or bureaucracy. A system that bent over backwards to shield its own. But seeing it laid out like this, a paper trail of brutality stretching back years, lit a fire in her chest she couldn't extinguish. Who signed off on these? She asked, her voice low. Dangerous. Maya flipped through another file, her brow furrowing. Most of them are stamped by a Captain Reynolds. Looks like he's been Briggs' guardian angel. But there's overlap. Some of these got kicked up higher. Chief Holloway's name pops up on a few. Holloway. Amara echoed, her mind racing. James Holloway, the police chief. A man whose polished suits and measured words hid a reputation for keeping the department's dirt under lock and key. She'd clashed with him before, subtle power plays in meetings. His insistence on handling things internally. Now his signature stared back at her. A thread she could pull to unravel the whole damn tapestry. We need more, Amara said, standing to pace the room. Witnesses, recordings, anything that ties this to the top. If Holloway's in this, Briggs is just the tip of the iceberg. Maya nodded, already typing on her phone. Jamal's on it. He's tracking down Darius Jackson tomorrow. Says the guy's still in Chicago. Still pissed. Might talk if he knows there's a judge in his corner. Good, Amara said, pausing by the window. The city glittered below, a patchwork of lights and shadows. But she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching her, unseen. Unrelenting. Her phone buzzed again. Another anonymous text. You're digging your own grave. She stared at it, her pulse steady, then deleted it without a word. They wanted her scared. They'd have to try harder. The next morning, the courthouse was a battlefield of whispers. Amara walked through the halls, her head high, but she felt the shift. Colleagues who'd once nodded in greeting now avoided her gaze. Their conversations hushing as she passed. In the break room, she reached for the coffee pot, only to have a white prosecutor, some slick-haired hotshot named Bennett, step in front of her. Oh, let me get that, he said, his tone dripping with false courtesy. Wouldn't want you spilling anything. Judge, you've got enough on your plate. She met his eyes, unblinking. I can pour my own coffee. Bennett, step aside. He smirked, lingering just long enough to make it a challenge, then moved. As she filled her mug, she caught his muttered aside to another lawyer. She's too sensitive about all this. Probably why she's making it personal. Too sensitive. Another jab. Another way to dismiss her fight as emotion instead of justice. She sipped her coffee, letting the burn ground her, and walked away without a word. They didn't get to define her. Later, in her chambers, a clerk knocked hesitantly. Judge Sinclair? Security's asking you to sign in again. New protocol, they said. Amara frowned, glancing at the clock. It was her third time that week. While her white counterparts breezed through unchecked, she signed the log, her pen pressing hard enough to dent the paper, and handed it back with a look that made the clerk shrink. Subtle, insidious. These were the rules she'd always navigated. The ones that reminded her she'd never fully belong. By evening, Maya returned with news. Darius is in, she said, breathless. Met Jamal at a diner. He's got scars, physical and otherwise. Says Briggs called him a thug before laying into him. No body cam footage, conveniently, but he's willing to testify if we can protect him. Amara nodded, her mind already mapping the next steps. Get him a lawyer, someone we trust, and tell Jamal to keep digging. Reynolds, Holloway, anyone else who's touched these cases. We're building a wall they can't tear down. Maya hesitated, then lowered her voice. Amara, this is bigger than we thought. Darius said Briggs bragged about having friends upstairs. What if this goes beyond the PD? What if it's political? Then we take it all the way. Amara said, her voice steel. No half measures. That night, alone in her apartment, Amara stood by her window. The city's hum a distant roar. Another text buzzed through. Stop now or you won't like what comes next. She stared at it, her reflection hard in the glass. They thought they could bury her like they'd buried Darius. Like they'd buried every name in that box. But she wasn't a victim. She was a judge. A black woman who'd spent her life proving she could outlast them all. And she was just getting started. Part 4. Preparing for battle. The air in Amara Sinclair's chambers felt heavier each day, as if the walls themselves were bracing for the fight ahead. It was late March 2025. A week after Nathan Briggs' arrest, and the city of Chicago pulsed with a restless energy, half outrage, half anticipation. Amara sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files and a whiteboard scrawled with names, dates, and connections. Briggs, Reynolds, Holloway. Maya had turned their investigation into a war room, and every piece of evidence they uncovered tightened the noose around the system that had protected Briggs for so long. She rubbed her temples. The ache in her side from Briggs' shove a dull reminder of why she couldn't stop. The video, the complaints, Darius Jackson's testimony, it was all coming together. A case so airtight it could choke the lies out of the police union's spin machine. But airtight didn't mean easy. Amara knew the stakes, knew the cost, and as she glanced at her phone, silent for once, her thoughts drifted to the one person who could make her second-guess this war. Her son, Isaiah, was 16. The same age as the boy Briggs had pinned to the courthouse steps. He'd texted her earlier that day, Mom, people at school are talking about you. Some cops drove by our house last night. You okay? She'd replied with a quick I'm fine. Baby, don't worry. But the words felt hollow. Isaiah was a quiet kid. Smart, with her eyes and his grandfather's stubborn streak. He'd grown up hearing her stories, triumphs in the courtroom. Battles against a system that didn't want her there, but this was different. This was real, and it was close, and she couldn't shield him from the fallout. A knock pulled her back. Maya entered, followed by a man Amara didn't recognize, tall, wiry, with a faded CPD jacket and a cautious gaze. This is Officer Daniel Tate, Maya said, shutting the door. He reached out after the arrest. Wants to help. Amara arched a brow, sizing him up. Help how? Tate shifted, his hands clasped tight. I've been with the department 10 years. Seen stuff, Briggs, others like him. I'm tired of the cover-ups. I was there in 22 when he roughed up that kid Maya mentioned. I wrote a report. Next day, Reynolds told me to rewrite it or kiss my badge goodbye. I rewrote it. He paused, shame flickering in his eyes. I shouldn't have. Amara leaned forward, her voice measured. Why now? Because you're doing what I couldn't. Tate said, I've got logs, shift records, radio calls, stuff that puts Briggs at scenes he claimed he wasn't. It's not much, but it's something. It's a start, Amara said, nodding to Maya. Get it documented, chain of custody tight. They'll try to bury anything we don't lock down. As Tate left, Maya lingered. He's scared, but he's legit. Jamal's got Darius prepped too, lawyers on board. We're ready to file charges tomorrow. Assault, excessive force, abuse of power, grand juries next. Amara exhaled, the weight settling deeper. Good, but they'll hit back, hard. They already are, Maya said, pulling out her phone. Union's got a rally planned, support our officers. And the Tribune ran a piece this morning calling you divisive. Bennett's quoted saying you've got a vendetta. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line. A vendetta. Another subtle twist of the knife. Framing her fight as personal spite instead of justice. She'd felt it all week, the sidelong glances. The extra scrutiny. Yesterday, at a judicial luncheon, she'd approached a table of colleagues discussing a high-profile case, only to have the conversation die as she sat down. Judge Hargrove, an older white man with a penchant for backroom deals, had smiled thinly and said, "Oh, we wouldn't want to bore you, Amara. You've got bigger fish to fry." The exclusion stung, a quiet reminder that her fight made her an outsider, even among peers. "They can call it what they want," she said finally. "We've got the truth." Maya nodded, but her eyes held a flicker of worry. "Just be careful, okay? Isaiah's not the only one noticing cop cars. I saw one parked outside my place last night." Amara's chest tightened, but she kept her face steady. "They're testing us, seeing if we'll flinch." "We won't." That night, she drove home under a sky bruised with clouds, the city's lights smearing into streaks against her windshield. Isaiah was waiting in the living room, his lanky frame hunched over a textbook. He looked up as she dropped her keys on the counter, his brow furrowed. "Mom, this is getting big. People at school say you're a hero. But online, some of it's ugly. They're calling you names, saying you hate cops." She sat beside him, brushing a hand over his hair. "People say a lot when they're scared. Zay, doesn't make it true." He frowned, unconvinced. "What if they do something? Those cars, I don't like it." "I don't either," she admitted, her voice softening. "But I can't stop now. That boy Briggs hurt? He could have been you. Every kid he's beaten, every family he's broken, they deserve someone to fight for them. I've got the power to do that. I have to." Isaiah nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. "Just promise you'll be okay." "I promise I'll fight like hell to be," she said, pulling him into a hug. It was the best she could offer. Later, alone in her bedroom, Amara stood by the window, watching a patrol car idle across the street. Its headlights flicked off, then on, a silent taunt. Her phone buzzed. "Back off. Judge, last chance." She stared at it, her resolve hardening like steel. They thought they could intimidate her into silence, like they'd done to so many before. But she wasn't Darius, rewriting his truth under pressure. She wasn't Tate, bending to save his badge. She was Amara Sinclair, and she'd spent her life preparing for this battle. Tomorrow, they'd file the charges. Tomorrow, the war would escalate. She turned from the window, the city's hum a distant roar, and slept with her fists clenched, ready for the fight. Part 5. The trial commences. The courtroom hummed with a restless energy as the trial of Officer Nathan Briggs began. A storm of anticipation crackling through the air. It was early April 2025, and the Chicago courthouse had become a crucible, reporters jostling for seats. Cameras flashing outside, the weight of a city's eyes pressing down on every move. Judge Amara Sinclair sat on the bench, her robes a shield against the chaos, her face a mask of calm authority. She'd recused herself from presiding over this case. Ethics demanded it after Briggs' assault, but she was still the architect of this moment, the one who'd set it all in motion. Now, she watched from the gallery, her presence a silent thunderclap. The prosecution, led by a sharp-eyed assistant DA named Carla Ortiz, opened with a precision that cut through the room's tension like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ortiz began, her voice steady, resonant. "This is not a case about one bad day or one mistake. This is about a pattern, a deliberate, documented history of violence and abuse of power by Officer Nathan Briggs. On March 15, 2025, he assaulted a sitting judge, Amara Sinclair, in broad daylight. But that was just the spark. Today, you'll see the fire he's been feeding for years." The video played first, projected on a screen that dominated the courtroom. The jury watched in silence as Briggs pinned the teenage boy to the steps. His sneering dismissal of Amara, the shove that sent her crashing down. Gasps rippled through the gallery. But Amara didn't flinch. She'd lived it, felt the cold stone bite into her palms, heard the venom in his voice. Now, she watched Briggs, seated at the defense table, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't look untouchable anymore. Ortiz called Darius Jackson next. He walked to the stand, His shoulders squared but his hands trembling slightly, a man in his late 20s. Scars faint on his knuckles. His voice low but firm. It was July 2018. He said, eyes flickering to Briggs. Traffic stop on the south side. I asked why he pulled me over. He called me a thug. Said I didn't belong there. Then he yanked me out. Slammed me against the car. I woke up in the hospital, concussion. Busted lip. Filed a complaint, but it went nowhere. The defense pounced. Briggs' lawyer, a slick veteran named Paul Grayson, leaned in with a practiced smile. Mr. Jackson, you've had run-ins with the law before, correct? A possession charge in 2017? Darius nodded, unflinching. Dropped. Never convicted. Doesn't change what he did. Grayson pressed, his tone smooth, patronizing. And you expect us to believe this wasn't a heated moment you escalated? An officer doing his job? I had my hands up. Darius shot back, his voice rising. Same as that kid on the steps. He didn't care. The room shifted, the jury's eyes narrowing. Amara felt a flicker of pride. Darius wasn't bending. Ortiz followed with more witnesses. The woman from 2020. Her wrist still stiff from Briggs' grip. A mother whose son had come home bloodied in 22. Each story built the case brick by brick. A wall of truth the defense couldn't easily tear down. But Grayson was ready. When Ortiz rested, he stood, his voice dripping with confidence. This case isn't about justice, it's about revenge. Judge Sinclair, a respected figure, yes, but one with a personal stake. She's turned this into a crusade against law enforcement. And my client's caught in the crossfire. Officer Briggs acted to maintain order. He didn't know who she was. How could he? She wasn't in robes. He reacted to a perceived threat. Amara's fingers tightened around the bench's edge. A perceived threat. Another twist. Another way to paint her as the aggressor. She caught Maya's eye from across the room. Her mentee sat near the front, scribbling notes. Her jaw clenched. They'd expected this, but it still burned. Grayson called his first witness. A fellow officer named Mike Callahan. Stocky, red-faced. He swaggered to the stand. His testimony rehearsed. I've worked with Nate for years. He's tough but fair. That day, the kid was mouthing off. And this woman, Judge Sinclair, stepped in. Got in his face. He reacted like any cop would. Ortiz pounced on Cross. Officer Callahan, were you there when Briggs assaulted Darius Jackson in 2018? Callahan blinked, caught off guard. No. I. Or the woman in 2020? The boy in 22? Ortiz pressed, her voice sharp. Were you there for any of those? No, he muttered, shifting in his seat. So you can't speak to his pattern. She said, turning to the jury, only to the story you've been told to sell. The day ended with the prosecution ahead. But the defense had planted seeds, doubt about Amara's motives. Whispers of bias. As the courtroom emptied, she lingered, catching fragments of conversation. A reporter muttered, she's got guts, but this could tank her career. A juror glanced her way, then quickly away. She felt the weight of it all, the city watching, judging, waiting for her to falter. Outside, the air was thick with spring dampness and the chants of protesters. Justice for Amara. End the blue shield. Clashing with a smaller knot of police supporters waving back the blue signs. She slipped through a side exit, only to run into Bennett, the prosecutor from the break room, leaning against a wall with a smirk. Quite a show, Judge, he said, his tone oily. Hope you're ready for the blowback. Not everyone thinks you're the hero here, too close to it. You know, hard to stay objective when it's personal. Amara stopped, her eyes locking onto his. Objectivity doesn't mean ignoring the truth, Bennett. It means seeing it clearly. Maybe you should try it. His smirk faltered, but he shrugged, strolling off. Too close to it. Another jab. Another way to question her because of who she was. A black woman daring to challenge the system. She'd heard it in law school. In clerkships. In every room where her skin made her a target before she'd even spoken. But she wasn't here to play their game. Back home, Isaiah met her at the door. His face tight. Mom, they're saying you're after revenge. Online, on TV, it's everywhere. She pulled him close, her voice steady. Let them talk, Zay. We've got the evidence. That's what matters. But as she lay awake that night, the trial's first day replaying in her mind, She couldn't shake Bennett's words, or the anonymous text that buzzed through just before dawn. "You're not winning this." She stared at it, her resolve a quiet flame. They could try to break her. They wouldn't. Part 6. The Turning Tide. The trial stretched into its third week, and the Chicago courthouse had become a pressure cooker, every seat filled, every whisper amplified, every glance loaded with judgment. By mid-April 2025, the city teetered on a razor's edge, its streets alive with protests and counter-protests, its air thick with the scent of spring rain and simmering rage. Judge Amara Sinclair sat in the gallery again, her hands clasped tight, watching the prosecution build a fortress of evidence around Nathan Briggs. But she knew walls could crumble, and the defense was waiting for its moment to strike. Carla Ortiz, the assistant DA, had dominated so far, witness after witness, video after video, a relentless march of truth that left Briggs' smug facade in tatters. The jury's faces had hardened over the days, their eyes flickering between sympathy and disgust as they heard from victims like Darius Jackson and saw the courthouse steps footage replayed in excruciating detail. Amara felt the tide turning, a slow but undeniable shift. Yet beneath her steady exterior, a thread of doubt tugged at her. How far would the system bend to protect its own? That morning, everything changed. Ortiz stood before the bench, her voice cutting through the room's hum. The prosecution calls Jamal Carter to the stand. A murmur rippled through the gallery as Jamal, Maya's journalist friend, lean and sharp-eyed in a worn blazer, strode forward. Amara's pulse quickened. She'd known he was digging, but this was a surprise even to her. Jamal swore in, his gaze steady as he faced Ortiz. "Mr. Carter," she began, "you've investigated Officer Briggs' history. What did you find?" He leaned into the mic, his voice calm but electric. "A video from November 2019, a bodega on the west side. Security cam caught Briggs beating a man unconscious. Black guy, early 30s, no weapon. Briggs claimed he resisted arrest, but the footage shows him complying. Hands up, begging. Then Briggs just snapped, broke his jaw, kept going. Internal Affairs buried it, said the tape was inconclusive. I got it from a clerk who'd had enough." The courtroom erupted, gasps and shouts drowning out the judge's gavel. Amara's breath caught as Ortiz played the clip, grainy, silent, but brutal. Briggs' baton rose and fell, the man crumpling, blood pooling on the floor. The jury flinched, one woman covering her mouth. Briggs, at the defense table, went rigid, his face a mask of ash. Paul Grayson leapt up, his voice sharp. "Objection. This is unauthenticated, last-minute evidence, prejudicial and irrelevant." Ortiz didn't blink. "It's directly relevant to the pattern of behavior we've established. Your Honor, goes to character and intent." The judge, a stern older woman named Hargrove, no relation to Amara's luncheon snubber, peered over her glasses. "Overruled. It's admitted." The defense scrambled, but the damage was done. Jamal's testimony landed like a grenade, blowing holes in the narrative of Briggs as a misunderstood cop. Amara caught Maya's eye across the room, her mentee's grin was fierce. A silent "we've got him." But as the day wore on, Grayson fought back, calling witnesses to muddy the waters. Officers swearing Briggs was a model cop. A union representative claiming the video was out of context. The jury's faces grew unreadable again, and Amara felt the ground shift beneath her. That night, she sat alone in her chambers, the courthouse empty save for the echo of her thoughts. The new video was a game changer, but it came with a cost: more eyes on her, more enemies in the shadows. Her phone buzzed. "You can't hide from this." She deleted it, but the words lingered, a cold weight in her chest. She'd pushed this far, exposed too much. What if it wasn't enough? What if the system swallowed it all again? A knock startled her. Maya slipped in, her face flushed. "You okay? You looked off today." Amara sighed, rubbing her eyes. "Just tired. It's heavy." "Maya, Isaiah's scared. I'm dragging him into this mess, and I don't know if I can protect him." Maya sat across from her, her voice soft but firm. "You're not dragging him. You're showing him what it means to stand up. He's proud of you. I saw it when he came by last week. And out there," she gestured to the window, where distant chants echoed, "people are waking up because of you." I ran into a group outside, moms, kids, folks who've been quiet too long. They're with us. Amara's throat tightened. She'd seen the protests growing, signs with her name, voices demanding change. It was a lifeline, a reminder of why she couldn't stop. Thanks, she said quietly. I needed that. Maya grinned. Good, 'cause we're not done. Jamal's got more leads. Reynolds is sweating. We're close. The next day, the streets exploded. News of the bodega video hit the airwaves. And by noon, crowds swarmed the courthouse, hundreds. Then thousands. A sea of faces chanting no more lies, and justice now. Amara watched from a window, her heart pounding. Some held photos of Darius, of the boy from the steps, of names she didn't know but could guess, victims lost to the same silence she was breaking. Across the street, a smaller knot of police supporters waved their flags. But they were drowned out, outnumbered. Inside, the trial resumed with a new edge. Ortiz pressed Jamal on the stand, drawing out every detail. How he'd tracked the clerk, how the tape had been hidden in a misfiled box. Grayson tried to discredit him, sneering, "You're a freelancer, Mr. Carter, no credentials. Why should we trust your discovery?" But Jamal held firm, his calm dismantling the attack. The jury leaned in, and Amara felt the tide turn again, stronger this time. Back in the gallery, she overheard a white attorney mutter to another, "She's lucky she's got this much pull. Most wouldn't." Lucky. The word grated, a quiet jab that her success was a fluke, not skill. A nod to the assumption that a black woman couldn't rise this high on merit. She swallowed it, her focus sharp. Luck didn't build this case. She did. As court adjourned, Maya pulled her aside. "Reynolds is meeting with Holloway tonight. Jamal's tailing them. If we get something, it's over for Briggs." Amara nodded, her resolve stealing. The tide was turning, not just in the courtroom but in the streets, in the cracks of a system that couldn't hold much longer. She stepped outside, the chance washing over her like a wave. For the first time in weeks, she let herself believe they might win, not just for her, but for every voice rising with hers. The fire was spreading, and she was ready to let it burn. Part 7. Justice Prevails. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable masks etched with the weight of 3 weeks' worth of testimony. It was late April 2025, and the Chicago air outside buzzed with the hum of a city holding its breath. Inside, Judge Amara Sinclair sat in the gallery, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles ached, her eyes fixed on the 12 strangers who now held Nathan Briggs' fate. The trial had been a war, videos, witnesses, lies peeled back layer by layer, and today, it would end. She felt the eyes of the room on her too, the woman who'd lit this fuse. But she didn't waver. Judge Hargrove adjusted her glasses, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." She unfolded a paper, her hands steady. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Nathan Briggs, guilty. On the charge of excessive use of force, guilty. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty." The room erupted, gasps, cheers, a few angry shouts from the back where police supporters clustered. Amara exhaled, a slow release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Guilty on all counts. The words landed like hammer strikes, each one a crack in the wall that had shielded Briggs for years. She glanced at him, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, the arrogance stripped away. The cuffs snapped shut around his wrists again, a sound that echoed with finality. Ortiz turned from the prosecution table, catching Amara's eye with a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the victory they'd clawed from the system's grip. Maya, beside Amara, squeezed her arm, her grin fierce. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it." But it wasn't over yet. Sentencing came an hour later. The courtroom still packed, the air electric. Judge Hargrove called for order, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Briggs. "Officer Briggs," she began, her tone measured but firm. "You stood before this court as a man sworn to protect. Yet the evidence shows a pattern of violence, entitlement, and abuse spanning nearly a decade. You assaulted a judge, yes, but more than that, you betrayed the trust of this city, its people, its laws." She paused, letting the words sink in. The court sentences you to 15 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 10. You will also be stripped of your badge and barred from public service. This is not just punishment, it's a message. No one is above the law. The gavel fell, and the room exploded again. Briggs didn't react, his face blank as deputies led him out, his boots dragging against the floor. Amara watched him go, searching for remorse, but saw only the hollow shell of a man who'd lost everything he'd built on fear. She stood, her legs steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her, and stepped into the hall. Outside, the city roared. Crowds swarmed the courthouse steps, hundreds of voices chanting justice served, and no more silence. Their signs a forest of defiance. News vans lined the street, cameras rolling as reporters shouted questions. Amara slipped through a side door, avoiding the chaos, but she couldn't escape the weight of it, the victory. Yes, but also the cost. Her phone buzzed with texts. "Isaiah's proud of you. Mom." Maya's were trending everywhere. And another anonymous threat. "This isn't the end." She deleted the last one. Her jaw tight. Back in her chambers, she sank into her chair. The silence a stark contrast to the storm outside. The verdict was a win. A crack in the system's armor, but she knew it wouldn't be clean. Already, the police union was spinning it. Their statement flashing across her TV, an injustice to a dedicated officer. Railroaded by bias. Bias. Another jab. Another way to frame her fight as unfair. Emotional. Unearned. She heard footsteps and looked up to see Judge Hargrove at the door. Her expression stern but not unkind. "You've stirred a hornet's nest, Amara," she said, stepping inside. "Good work, but don't think it's over. They'll say you betrayed the system. Too personal. Too, you know." Amara met her gaze, unflinching. "They've been saying that my whole career. Ellen, doesn't make it true." Hargrove nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "No, it doesn't. Just watch your back." She left, and Amara leaned back, the words lingering. Too personal. Another subtle dig, another assumption that her identity, black, female, defiant, tainted her judgment. She'd heard it in the halls that week. Whispers from colleagues. She's brave. But she's pushing too hard. This'll cost her. Betrayal, they called it, as if holding power accountable was a crime. Isaiah burst in minutes later, his school bag slung over one shoulder, his face alight. "Mom, it's everywhere. Kids at school are freaking out. Some hate it, but most think you're a badass." He hugged her, and she laughed, the sound raw and real. "Language, Zay," she teased, but her chest warmed. "You okay with all this?" He nodded, serious now. "Yeah, you did the right thing. That's what matters." As he left to grab food, Amara turned to the window. The city's lights a patchwork below. The chants still echoed, a tide of voices she'd unleashed. Briggs was down, but the war wasn't won, not yet. Her phone buzzed again. "Jamal. Reynolds is talking to lawyers. Holloway's next." She smiled, a quiet, fierce thing. The tide had turned, and she wasn't done writing it. Outside, the protests swelled, a city divided but alive, some cheering her name, others cursing it. She'd given them a verdict, a spark, and now the fire was theirs to carry. Justice had prevailed, but it was only the beginning. Part 8. The Ripple Effect. The verdict echoed beyond the courtroom walls, a seismic wave that rippled through Chicago and beyond. By May 2025, Nathan Briggs' conviction was more than a headline, it was a reckoning. The city simmered with a new energy, its streets alive with voices that had been silent too long, its power structures trembling under the weight of scrutiny. Judge Amara Sinclair stood at the center of it all, no longer just a judge but a symbol, a spark that had ignited something unstoppable. She felt it every day, the eyes, the whispers, the hope, but also the shadows creeping closer. The first crack came fast. 2 days after the sentencing, Chief James Holloway resigned. The announcement was terse, slipped into a late-night press release. "Personal reasons necessitate my departure." No fanfare, no farewell speech, just a quiet exit that fooled no one. Jamal's digging, paired with the trial's fallout, had turned up heat, whispers of doctored reports, hushed payoffs, a network of protection that stretched from patrol cars to the chief's office. Holloway's name on those buried complaints, uncovered by Maya's relentless team, had made him a liability. He vanished from public view. But Amara knew men like him didn't fade, they waited. The Chicago PD reeled. Internal investigations launched overnight, spurred by public outrage and a flood of new complaints, victims stepping forward. Emboldened by Briggs' fall, Captain Reynolds, Holloway's right hand, faced suspension. His office raided for files that matched Jamal's leaks. The union howled, staging rallies with "Support Our Cops" banners. But their numbers dwindled, drowned out by crowds chanting "Clean the Shield." Outside precincts, Amara watched it unfold on the news, her chest tight with a mix of triumph and unease. She'd cracked the dam, but the flood was only beginning. Her own life shifted too. Invitations poured in, speeches, panels, TV interviews. A national civil rights group asked her to keynote their convention in D.C., calling her a beacon for reform. She accepted, standing before a packed auditorium in June, her voice steady as she said, "Justice isn't a gift, it's a fight. We've won a battle, but the war's not over. It's on all of us to keep pushing." The crowd roared, a sea of faces, black, brown, white, united by her words. She saw Isaiah in the front row, his grin wide, and felt a surge of purpose. This was bigger than her now. But the spotlight came with knives. Threats multiplied. Letters slipped under her door. Calls in the dead of night. A brick through her car window with "Traitor" scrawled in red. Isaiah found her scrubbing the paint off one morning, his face pale. "Mom, this is crazy. Why won't they stop?" She knelt beside him, her hands steady on his shoulders. "Because they're scared, Zay. Scared of what happens when people like us don't back down. We'll be okay, I promise." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on the jagged glass. She hated that fear in him, hated that she couldn't shield him completely. Yet she couldn't stop either, not when the tide was turning. Not when others were rising with her. Maya became her anchor, her team swelling with volunteers, lawyers, activists, even cops like Daniel Tate who'd crossed the line to help. They pored over new cases, old files dragged into the light by families who'd lost sons, daughters, hope. One night, Maya burst into Amara's chambers, her eyes alight. "We've got 3 more officers tied to Reynolds. Complaints from 19, 21, 23, all buried. Ortiz is filing charges tomorrow." Amara smiled, a rare, unguarded thing. Good, keep the pressure on. The city felt it too. Protests morphed into organizing, community groups forming, watchdogs demanding body cam reforms, candidates running on platforms of accountability. Amara met with them, her voice a steady drumbeat. "Don't let this fade. Make it last." She saw Darius Jackson at one meeting, his scars a quiet testament, now mentoring kids on the South Side. He nodded to her, a silent thank you, and she knew this was why she'd fought. But the old guard pushed back. A Tribune op-ed hit the stands, penned by a retired judge. "Sinclair's win is impressive, but an exception. The system bends for few." An exception. The word stung, a subtle jab that her victory was a fluke, not a shift, that a black woman's triumph was rare, not earned. She overheard it at a bar association dinner too, a white attorney sipping scotch, muttering, "She's a unicorn, not a trend. Most don't get this far. Most." Another quiet erasure, a reminder that her skin still marked her as an outlier. She brushed it off, but it lingered, a splinter under her resolve. Later, at home, Isaiah showed her a viral video, kids reenacting her courthouse stand. Captioned "Judge Badass." She laughed, the sound easing the ache. "See, Mom," he said, "they're not all against you." "I know, Zay," she said, ruffling his hair. "That's what keeps me going." By summer's end, the ripple effect was undeniable. The PD announced a task force, half-hearted. But a start. Lawsuits piled up, settlements forced from tight fists. Amara's name became a rallying cry. Her face on protest signs from New York to LA. She stood on her apartment balcony one evening, the city sprawling below, its lights a map of change she'd helped draw. Her phone buzzed. "Jamal. Holloway's meeting someone big tomorrow. Political. We're on it." She exhaled, the night air cool against her skin. The threats hadn't stopped. Another text that day. "You'll pay," but neither had she. The system was cracking, its shadows shrinking under the glare she'd turned on it. She wasn't just a judge anymore, she was a force. And others were rising to join her. The ripple was becoming a wave, and she'd ride it as far as it would take her. Part 9. A New Dawn. Summer faded into September 2025, and Chicago settled into a fragile new rhythm, a city scarred but stirring. Its pulse quickened by the echoes of a trial that had rewritten its rules. Judge Amara Sinclair stood at the edge of it all, her name now a whisper on the wind, a banner in the streets, a weight she carried with every step. Nathan Briggs' conviction had been the spark, but the fire it lit burned far beyond one man or one courtroom. It was a dawn she'd fought for, bled for, and now she faced the question of what came next. Her chambers were quieter these days, the chaos of spring replaced by a steady hum of purpose. Files still piled high, new cases, old injustices dragged into the light, but the air felt different. Lighter. She sat at her desk one evening, the golden glow of sunset spilling through the window. A letter in her hands from a mother whose son's case had reopened thanks to her fight. "You gave us hope," it read. "We thought no one would listen." She folded it carefully, tucking it into a drawer with dozens like it, a reminder of why she couldn't stop. The ripple effect had grown into a tide. Holloway's resignation had cracked the Chicago PD open. Reynolds faced charges now, his network of cover-ups unraveling thread by thread. Jamal's latest scoop, a recorded meeting between Holloway and a state senator, hinted at political strings pulled to shield the old guard. It hit the news like a bomb, forcing resignations up the chain, sparking calls for a federal probe. The system wasn't broken yet, but it was bending. And Amara saw her hand in every fracture. She'd become more than a judge. Schools invited her to speak, teenagers like Isaiah hanging on her words, asking how to fight like she did. Community groups named awards after her, their leaders saying, "You showed us we can win." She mentored Maya too, watching her bloom into a force of her own, filing cases, rallying volunteers, her fire a mirror of Amara's younger self. One night, Maya burst in, breathless. "We got a settlement, $2 million for Darius' family. And he's starting a youth program. Says it's because of you." Amara smiled, her chest warm. "It's because of us, all of us." But the cost lingered. Threats still came, texts, calls. A slashed tire one rainy morning. Isaiah found her staring at it, his voice tight. "Mom, this isn't fair. You won. Why won't they leave us alone?" She pulled him close, her voice steady. "Winning doesn't end the fight, Zay. It just changes it. They're mad because they're losing ground. We keep going, for you. For everyone." He nodded, his jaw set like hers. And she saw the man he was becoming, strong, not broken. It was enough to keep her standing. The city reflected that strength. Protests had evolved, less chaos, more purpose. Watchdog groups tracked police reforms, their reports sharp and unrelenting. A new mayor ran on accountability, her platform echoing Amara's speeches. On the south side, murals sprang up, Amara's face alongside Darius, the boy from the steps. Names of the forgotten now painted in bold colors. She drove by one day, Isaiah pointing. "That's you, Mom. Badass Judge Sinclair." She laughed, the sound raw and free. "Guess I'm stuck with that now." But the old wounds stayed close. At a judicial conference in August, a white colleague, Judge Carver, gray-haired and smug, cornered her by the coffee bar. "Hell of a run, Amara," he said, his tone oily. "You should be grateful the system didn't crush you. Most in your shoes wouldn't have made it this far." Grateful. The word dripped with condescension. A quiet jab that her survival was luck, not grit. A nod to the expectation that a black woman should have folded long ago. She met his eyes, her voice ice. "I didn't need it to spare me, Carver. I made it bend." He blinked, retreating, but the sting lingered. She'd heard it before. Law school profs saying she'd overachieved, clerks implying her clerkship was a favor. Even now, with her name on the nation's lips, they saw her as an anomaly, not a force. She shook it off, but it fueled her, every slide a brick in the wall she'd keep building. That night, she stood by her apartment window, the city sprawling below, a tapestry of lights and shadows, hope and struggle. Her phone buzzed. "Jamal." Senators cutting a deal. More names coming. She smiled. A quiet, fierce thing. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield was hers now. She thought of her father. A lawyer broken by unwinnable fights. His voice in her ear. Keep going. Mara, they can't stop you. She'd made his dream real. Justice not just a word, but a weapon. Isaiah joined her. His textbook forgotten. What's next, Mom? She looked at him, then back at the city. More. Zay. More cases. More voices. We don't stop, not till it's fair for everyone. He nodded, leaning against her, and they stood there, the night wrapping around them. The threats hadn't faded. Another text that day. You'll regret this, but neither had her resolve. She deleted it, her fingers steady. Let them come. She'd faced worse and won. A week later, she spoke at a rally. Thousands gathered. Their cheers a roar that shook the ground. This isn't my fight, she said, her voice ringing out. It's ours. Every step we take, every truth we tell, builds something they can't break. Don't stop now. The crowd erupted, a wave of defiance, and she saw Maya in the front, fist raised, Isaiah beside her, eyes bright. As she stepped off the stage, a reporter asked, Judge Sinclair, what's justice to you? She paused, the question settling deep. It's not a verdict, she said finally. It's a promise, a fight we keep alive every day. And we're just getting started. She walked away, the city's hum a heartbeat beneath her feet. The dawn was new, fragile, but real, forged in fire. Carried by voices she'd helped free. Amara Sinclair wasn't done. She'd fight as long as it took. And she wouldn't fight alone.